Center on Aging and the MAGIC program, and I'm also on the MGS board. It's great to see a number of attendees from all over the state. We have been sponsoring these webinars every month for the past couple years. We have only increased in our technical abilities and in turn seen more and more people join us each month. And I really appreciate you joining us. Today's topic has been of special interest. Right off of the start, we had about 50 people register on the very first day. These monthly webinars are really a hallmark of our two programs, and we want to continue to bring timely topics to you and to your organization. More details and information about upcoming webinars can be found on MGS's website at www.mngero.org. That's www.mngero.org. If you go to our MGS website and then to the webinar page, you'll find links for our annual conference coming up. Our annual conference is next April, so mark your calendar. It's April 24th, 2015, and it's called Designing Our Destiny, Aging Ain't for Sissies. Challenges, Opportunities, and Affordability. And like I said, that's Friday, April 24th, 2015, so you can mark your calendar to join us at the Earl Brown Heritage Center. A few logistics for today's seminar. Your conference audio is muted. If you have a question for the speaker, please feel free to type the question into the chat area at the bottom of the screen. I will be monitoring that. If you have to leave the webinar early, just close your browser, hang up your phone. If you have other questions or concerns, please feel free to email us at MGS. After the webinar today, you will be emailed an evaluation. We're very interested in learning what you liked and what you didn't like, what you think we can do better, and any future topic ideas. We take your ideas and suggestions very seriously, and we do try to respond to them. Further information on continuing education credits is also available at the end of the webinar. So today I want to welcome Janet Yates. She's a licensed marriage and family therapist and co-founder of the Hoarding Project. Janet earned her master's degree in marriage and family therapy at Bethel University and a second master's degree in family social science from the University of Minnesota. Her research interests involve the influence of trauma, grief, and loss on hoarding behavior, as well as developing effective and ethical approaches to mandatory hoarding cleanouts. She has published multiple articles on the hoarding disorder and ambiguous loss. Janice teaches courses in trauma and hoarding in the Marriage and Family Therapy Master's Degree Program at St. Mary's University of Minneapolis, Minnesota. She currently practices therapy in her private practice in St. Paul, Minnesota, and she chairs the Minnesota Hoarding Task Force. She is also available for radio, TV, and print interviews. And so we're pleased to welcome you today, Janet, and we appreciate you joining us to talk about hoarding.
Thank you, Pat. I'm happy to do so. Thanks to all of you who have joined the webinar. I hope that you will find this to be helpful for you and informative as you think about working with hoarding, especially with the population of seniors. I don't believe we are seeing more seniors hoarding. I think that this has always been an issue for seniors, but because hoarding is becoming more and more known, the topic itself is generating more interest, it appears that we're seeing a lot more hoarding than we used to. I don't think that's the case. I think we've always been seeing hoarding. We didn't know that we were seeing it, and we didn't know what it looked like. So what I'm hoping with today's webinar is to give you a better idea of what it looks like, what to expect, how to think about treatment, and how to work with the folks that you are working with who are exhibiting hoarding behaviors. So let's get into it. As Pat said, you can ask your questions. She will be interrupting the process to ask those questions as we go so that we can make sure to attend to those as you have them. And then I will also try to leave some time at the end for further questions as well. So let's get going. What we're going to do today is get a background on hoarding. We'll look at safety and health issues that are involved with hoarding, get a cursory look at measurement and assessment tools, and then talk about what is it that we do when we encounter a homeowner with a hoarding situation. So let's start with a background on hoarding. What is hoarding disorder? Well, hoarding is a mental health disorder that has public safety implications. And this is very important to understand the both and here, that it's a mental health issue and public safety issue. Currently, most of our communities are only addressing the public safety piece, not addressing the mental health. And so what we're finding is recurrence of hoarding. We're finding re-hoarding in homes that have been forced cleaned out. And that's because we're not addressing the issue where it really lies, which is as a mental health issue. And so, as with anything, if we only address part of the issue, then we certainly can't anticipate resolving a concern or resolving a disorder. There is hope with hoarding that the treatment strategies that engage both mental health and public safety can help a person to stop the behaviors. Just because a person hoards now doesn't mean that that's all that they're left to. And I find that to be very hopeful, and hope that that is for you as well. Last May, we were given with the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, a definition and a new disorder called hoarding disorder. In the past, hoarding was seen as a symptom within obsessive-compulsive personality disorder. It is true that some people who hoard also have obsessive-compulsive issues, but that's a small number of people who hoard. So I'm very glad that the APA gave hoarding its own designation. That's going to help us with our education and raising awareness around the importance of holistic treatment to hoarding. So let's get at the definition of hoarding disorder. Let me note that you want to have all four of the parts of the definition in order to designate hoarding disorder for a diagnosis for your clients. The first part of the definition is excessive acquisition, and by that we mean either passive or active or both means of acquiring stuff. This would be a good place to stop for a moment and talk about language. When we talk about the things that are hoarded, you already know not to call them junk or garbage or something worse, but lots of people do call the things that are hoarded junk, trash, and that's not helpful. The person who hoards sees what they hoard as a treasure, sees it as important to them. And we don't have to agree that everything that they're hoarding is a treasure, but we do need to understand where they're coming from and how they talk about it. And when we've talked with people who hoard, we've talked with family members, they tell us that use of the word stuff is okay. So that doesn't communicate disrespect about the things that are hoarded. So that's why the definition has excessive acquisition of stuff. That's an okay term to use when you're talking about the hoard. Another language piece is in what we call people who hoard. As you can imagine, calling someone a hoarder is really limiting. It's labeling them. It is speaking to only a part of who they are, but making that part the whole. So just as we don't label people with other diagnoses, the depressed person over there or the schizophrenic coming into my office, we say the person with a schizophrenia diagnosis or the person with a depression diagnosis. Same thing with hoarding. The person who hoards or an individual who hoards, a hoarding situation, that kind of thing. Let go of that word hoarder. It's just not helpful, and it labels too much, and it doesn't recognize that people who hoard are also many other roles and have many other titles. So this helps us immediately sort of get a different perspective and lose that stereotype that we have about who it is that actually hoards. So back to our definition, the excessive acquisition of stuff. Passive acquisition is the acquiring in which we don't actually do anything to bring the stuff in. For example, junk mail. I imagine you are like me, that if you didn't do anything with the junk mail that comes into your home every day, you could probably have a hoarded room pretty quickly. So junk mail comes in, perhaps inheritance. Someone leaves you furniture or some sort of item, that kind of thing. So it's the person is not going out and bringing things in, things are coming to them. Active acquisition is the act of going out and getting things. So shopping either at regularly priced stores or thrift stores, collecting free things, that could be out on the lawn, you know, that kind of thing, where a piece of furniture gets a free poster on it and it gets taken away at some point. It could also be gifts. It could be things that when we go to public places, there often are free things. For example, if you go to the public library, the library is very helpful to us who want to communicate things about our there's a lot of free things that can be taken, and people who hoard often collect those free things. So that's the first part of the definition. Now, we wouldn't have so much of a problem with excessive acquiring without the second part of the definition, and that is the difficulty in discarding possessions. So while things may come in, the real problem seems to become that things are not going out. And so there becomes this emotional attachment. There becomes an overwhelmed sense. How could I ever get rid of these things, or where do I start? That kind of thing. So as you can see, the first two parts of the definition really sort of go together. The third part of the definition is a part that I would encourage you to use for assessment, to begin to ask about whether or not there might be hoarding going on in the home. And that is, the living spaces are no longer able to be used for their intended purpose. So the assessment question could be, can you use your bedroom to sleep in? Can you cook in your kitchen? Can you take a shower in your bathroom? Those kinds of things. When's the last time you were able to park the car in the garage? That sort of thing. So the living spaces in the home can't be used for their intended purpose. And then finally, the fourth part of the definition is that the hoarding and the activity itself causes significant distress and impairment. I would encourage you to think about distress being an emotional distress and impairment being physical impairment. So what I mean is the emotional distress that comes with collecting all of these things and not being able to use the home in the way that a person might want to. Perhaps the distress that comes when someone else comes into the home and says, you can't live like this. Or another family member says, I can't take this anymore. You know, we're cleaning your stuff out, we're getting rid of, that kind of thing causes emotional distress. The physical impairment is literally being unable to get through the home. So there are, you know, those goat paths. There are things on the floor that don't allow for safe movement. All cities have code about what is considered safe in a home, and 3-foot pathways are safe, having working smoke alarms, having entrances and exits that are cleared. Oftentimes in hoarded homes we don't have that. There's only perhaps one way to get into the home, and even that way is quite limited. So it's literal physical impairment from being unable to move through the home. So there's our definition. Again, we want to have all four of these parts in order to define this as hoarding. And we'll come back to this point, but I want to encourage you to use objective language when you talk with someone about hoarding. And the definitions give us that objective language. Again, we'll come back to that in a few minutes. This often gets asked of us, what is the difference between clutter, collecting, and hoarding? And the importance of this is, again, that it gives us objective language. Often when you talk to a person who hoards, they will tell you, well, I don't hoard, I just have a lot of clutter. Well, let's talk about what clutter really is so that you can speak factually about it rather than speaking from an opinion or a perception. So clutter, possessions are disorganized. They might be accumulated around the living areas, but they don't keep people from being able to use the living areas for their intended purpose. And there is no major difficulty with acquisition or with discarding. You can carry on the normal activities in the home. The best way to think about it is that clutter is temporary. It's perhaps around for a few days or a couple of weeks, but it's not a permanent fixture. You know, if you're like me, sometimes your desk at work can get pretty cluttered because it's a busy week. You've got a lot going on. You don't have time to file things away or to adequately deal with the mail. But within a couple of weeks, you do. And the office looks, quote unquote, normal. It looks back to being usable, that kind of thing. That's clutter. Temporary is the main word with that, and the other piece being that you can still use all the rooms in the home or in the office for their intended purpose. When we move to collecting, now we're talking about new possessions that become a larger part of what we have in our home. And the display of those collections, again, don't keep people from being able to use the rooms in their home. Those displays tell us something about that person. If we walk into, at Christmas, if we walk into the home of someone who collects those Christmas villages, they display them throughout the house, and we can say, okay, this is something that you're interested in. What happens when we get into hoarding and we get too much stuff is either there's too many Christmas villages or there's too much other stuff that hides the display. So what happens with hoarding is that the collection, which is a fine thing to have, the collection is no longer seen. It's no longer visible because there's either too much to put out or there's too much stuff of other things that have been hoarded in the way. So there is some good language for clutter, good language for collecting, and then of course when we get into hoarding, then we have the clutter has turned permanent, the collections aren't seen, the rooms in the home can't be used for their intended purpose. How many people hoard? This is a tough question to answer, and I don't know that we'll ever be able to have an answer to this because I don't know how we ask people and get accurate answers. There is such stigma and a stereotype around hoarding in our country and around the world that to ask someone if they hoard most often will get us a response of, no, I just have clutter, or I'm cleaning up, or something, because TV shows have presented hoarding to be what crazy people do, that they have these extreme responses, that they're unhealthy, living with 200 rats or something like that. It's just not accurate and feeds into the inability for us to get accurate numbers. Here's what I can tell you about the state of Minnesota based on conversations with code enforcement, housing inspectors, fire departments around the state, that depending on the area, we see anywhere from 10 to 25% of people who hoard and hoarded homes in Minnesota. But here's the important thing I'd like you to keep in mind, that we're not just talking about the people who hoard. We're also talking about the people who are impacted. So let's just say that 10% of the population in Minnesota hoards. They are impacting the people who live with them. They impact the family members who don't live with them. They impact their communities, their neighbors. They impact professionals who come into the home. So whether the number is 2 to 5, 10, 25%, the bottom line is that hoarding is impacting a larger number of people than just the people who hoard. So when we look at U.S. figures, we're talking well into the millions. When we're looking at Minnesota figures, we're talking hundreds of thousands of people who are being impacted. That's a big number. And so it means we've got some work to do in order to help those folks that are being impacted by hoarding. Who hoards? This is an important question and an important answer because we want to make sure that in understanding who is hoarding, we are, again, diminishing that stereotype, that stigma that people have. If you say, well, let me say it differently. If I say to people what I do, co-founder of the Hoarding Project, I chair the task force, people will often say, oh, yeah, I know about hoarding. I've watched the TV shows. Well, as I said before, watching the TV shows only gives you one perspective, and that's extreme hoarding, extreme levels of hoarding. But there are other levels of hoarding before that. And we need to understand that people who hoard look just like us. You may know someone who hoards, and you don't know that they hoard because they, quote unquote, look okay. People who hoard are highly educated. They have good jobs. They are able to manage those jobs well, but when they come home, not so much. So we need to be clear that people who hoard are not just a certain look, not just a certain education level or socioeconomic status. We find people who hoard with low income and with high income and every income in between. Men and women hoard and young and old hoard. And oftentimes it appears that older people hoard more than anyone else. But likely the reason we think that is because they've had a longer time with which to collect things. And they've had less people managing. For example, we're seeing more children who hoard, which is something we're going to have to address at some point. Part of the reason I think we haven't recognized it in the past is that we haven't known what to look for. When a child hoards, usually mom and dad manage the hoarding. They go to school. They live on their own, and they're able to continue to collect. Then maybe in the 50s and 60s and so on, we're seeing a lot more hoarding. Their behaviors perhaps did not start when they were 50, but by 50, they didn't have parents managing their hoard. You see what I mean? So in the end, anyone could be a potential person who hoards. It doesn't make any difference regarding their gender, their socioeconomic status, or their education level. So here's the big question: what causes hoarding? And we have a few different things to look at here. You have the slides, so I will not go into great depth with these slides because you have this information in front of you, but we will talk about a systemic approach to looking at hoarding. And that's what I mean when I show you this little graph here of the circle of the social, biological, and psychological person within family, communities, cultures, and environment. At the Hoarding Project, we believe that we have to take a biopsychosocial perspective when it comes to treatment of hoarding. We need to look at the whole person, and we need to look at the person within the systems that they are. And we need to understand that the person who hoards affects their environment and their community, and their community and environment affects them. The research term for that is bidirectionality. It's going both ways. And we must understand that so that we can have this effective treatment of hoarding that looks at both the mental health and the public safety issues. So let's look at some of the factors. here. Biological factors that can contribute to hoarding. We have found that there is a genetic link. There's still a lot of work that needs to be done to help us understand that link better. But neuroscientists have found the same chromosome, which is 13, that we see Alzheimer's showing, we are also finding hoarding. So that's about as much as we know. Obviously, there's a lot more research that needs to be done, but that tells us that there is quite possibly a genetic link. There are brain functioning differences, and I want to here say this is, I'm not talking about something like dementia or traumatic brain injury. I'm talking about a healthy brain that has difficulty in the occipital and frontal lobes, that has difficulty with information processing, cognitive deficits, that kind of thing. Let me give you an example of what I mean. I collaborate with professional organizers who specialize in hoarding, and I had one of those organizers say to me that she was working with a client who hoards, and helping her do some sorting and clearing out of her home. And they came to part of the room that had a lot of shoe boxes. So she asked the woman to please organize these shoe boxes, and she'd come back in an hour, she'd go work on something else. She came back an hour later and nothing had been done. So the organizer asked the client, help me understand what's happened here, why haven't you organized the boxes? And the client said, well, I could organize them by who wears them, by the color of the boxes, by the size of the shoes, by the season. And she had 5 or 6 different categories for organizing. The problem for her was that she couldn't make a decision. And so the organizer said, let's do it this way. We'll organize the boxes by who wears them. 15 minutes later, the job is done. This is an example of how deficits in the brain, how the inability to perhaps categorize or just make a decision can keep someone stuck. And so the behaviors of the hoarding really were directly influenced by the inability to make some decisions. There's an example of some biological factors that can contribute to hoarding. Psychological factors that contribute to hoarding are around mental health and emotional distress. For the majority of people who hoard, there is some unresolved trauma or loss in their lives. And that unresolved trauma or loss and the avoidance of dealing with it becomes detrimental in the person's life to move forward. Let me tell you what I think happens for people when there is trauma or a number of traumas that are unresolved for their lives. Most of the time we hear from people that the traumas or losses are around relational losses. So perhaps a death or a divorce or some sort of break in a relationship. And the hole is left because of that break in the relationship, that relational loss. And rather than dealing with that loss because it seems too big or too difficult to process, the person wants to avoid. Hoarding then becomes a way to both avoid and fill that hole, because stuff isn't going to leave. People leave. That's what created the relational loss in the first place. And when someone leaves, folks are generally saying, I'm not going to try and fill that with another person because they could leave me too. So they fill it with stuff. The hole gets filled up. It's actually a pretty good coping mechanism as it stands. But then when there's too much stuff, then it no longer works. It may be a normal response, but it's perhaps not a healthy response. And the hoarding then becomes a coping mechanism for avoiding dealing with the trauma and loss. So when we get to working with a client who hoards due to this is their coping mechanism, we have to go back to that underlying reason for why they hoard. We have to go back and do that trauma, grief, and loss work with them to help them understand why they hoard, where those behaviors come from. And then we can address the behaviors as well. But so you can understand, this is why it's so important to bring mental health into the picture, to deal with the underlying reasons. Our community responses now are just addressing the public safety issues, the problems around the neighborhood, or the fact that the house is not safe. But that's dealing with really a surface level, dealing with the behaviors. We have to get underneath to help the person understand, to help them process. And then when they no longer need to fill that hole with stuff, then the behaviors can change. Then we can see some lasting change so that the person doesn't need to re-hoard. So there is something about what we see with most people who hoard, and with family members who talk to us about their loved one who hoards, some sort of unresolved trauma and loss, which may have happened in childhood, early adulthood, as a senior, you name it, it happens throughout life. We find that people who hoard do have specific beliefs about and attachments to their possessions. For some people, this becomes almost an exaggerated relationship in which items take on almost human characteristics. If I threw this away, or if I gave this sweater away, it would be sad. It might not get taken care of, that kind of thing. So if that happens, and if these attachments, which we might think are inappropriate, form, then it's very difficult to expect a person to simply get rid of them, because there's much more connection and attachment to those things. And hoarding behaviors get reinforced over time. It feels good when I go out and get things. It feels good when I bring things in and when I don't discard. So I'm going to keep doing that to feel good. It feels bad to throw things away. It feels bad to get rid of things, to clear out my home. So I'm not going to do that. So it's that sort of negative and positive reinforcement that can happen for people who hoard. Finally, social factors that contribute to hoarding can be the interpersonal relationships. Research done by my colleague Jennifer Sampson, who is the co-founder of the Hoarding Project, found that the better family connections, both in the past and the present, the less there will be hoarding. So this is important because in the past, families have not been connected to in order to help with long-term treatment and effective treatment. So to be able to reinforce and support family connection and family relationships can be effective in helping a person either hoard less, live safer, or not hoard at all. Now, let's talk about family for a minute here. As I said earlier, in the past, families were not addressed, even though, of course, families are quite affected by hoarding behaviors of their loved ones. Jennifer and I are both marriage and family therapists, and when we came to this work about 4 years ago, it seemed to us that one of the places that we needed to focus our work was with families. Families have their own stories of trauma and loss because of the hoarding behaviors. The person who hoards can tend to isolate and withdraw. Family members have lost that relationship. They've lost that mother or brother or person that they want to connect with. Families have invested a lot of money and time. Families are worried. They're disgusted. They don't understand. They think that for some reason their family member just doesn't care, won't clean up, just is refusing to do what they need to do. When we can work with families and help them understand what hoarding is, and help them understand that if there is unresolved trauma or loss, if there is a brain deficit, that kind of thing, they develop compassion for their loved one. And then when that happens, families are really critical to the long-term effectiveness, because the truth is we professionals have to step out at some point. Families are there. Families stay together, hopefully. But for the long term, oftentimes we're hoping and working with the family to stay with the person who hoards in order to have that longer term effective treatment. So we've got to do work with families. We can't just have our focus as professionals be on the person who hoards. We need to step back and look at the larger system. Major life events and transitions can impact a person who hoards. We've heard certainly plenty of situations in which all the kids went off to college and hoarding really took over, or a divorce happened and hoarding became the norm for that person. We've talked a bit about the social stigma, what the TV shows have said to us, the belief in our society that people who hoard are just lazy, they just don't want to clean up, that kind of thing. We're doing everything we can to change that stigma, and that's one of the reasons I'm glad so many of you are attending this webinar. The more educated you get, the more you're going to be able to educate and help us change that perception in our culture, because people who hoard know what the perception is. They know what the stigma is, and they know if they tell people that they hoard, that person that they tell is going to look at them and say, oh, there's something wrong with you. You just don't want to clean. Or so they're unlikely to tell people, not because they want to lie, but because they know that there is a stigma out there, and they know people will think badly of them if they find out what they do. I don't think we can separate hoarding from our culture when we think about a consumer culture, and about the fact that for our society in the U.S. and in Western European countries, especially in Australia, that has a very large hoarding problem, as well as countries like Canada and Finland, Denmark, Norway, other countries that have as well sort of a consumer perception. The idea is that the more you get, or the better that you get, then somehow you're better off. You're a better person. Well, we need to take that into consideration when we think about hoarding and how that might be affecting how people think about themselves and whether or not they are okay. This brings to mind our consideration of refugee families. Oftentimes in Minnesota, we have got lots of refugee families that have come, and we need to develop and encourage an understanding that refugee families have had to leave everything. And when they come to this country, some of them, as they start collecting things, are unwilling to let go of things because they've been here before where they were left with nothing. Somewhat similar to how we might think about someone who survived the Depression. I can't get rid of anything because you never know when you'll need it, and then you won't have the money in order to get it, that kind of thing. So that needs to be part of our mindset as well. There are most definitely co-occurring diagnoses with hoarding. Mostly we see high levels of major depressive disorder and anxiety disorder. We also see social phobias, and about a third of people who hoard also have obsessive-compulsive symptoms. We see personality disorders, some ADHD, and here's where I'd like to talk about dementia. To be quite succinct about it, the reason that a person with dementia hoards is because they don't remember what they have. And when we are looking at dementia and or traumatic brain injury, that kind of thing, the best thing we can do in terms of treatment is to engage other resources to help manage that person's hoard. Here's an example for you. There was a woman who lived in assisted living. The staff liked her, the family liked the staff, and she was happy in this assisted living, but she continued her hoarding behaviors. Now, she didn't remember what she had. She would bring things in and then forget that she had them, again, due to her dementia. And so the staff came to the family and said, she's making our building unsafe. We can't keep, we can't have a person who hoards here and put other residents and staff at risk. So the family worked out with the staff that once a week, when a staff person would take her down to dinner, family members would come and remove the things that this woman had collected over the week and was hoarding. She would come back to the room, not remembering that she had these things. She's happy, the staff is happy, and the family is happy. Obviously, we're not going to engage in therapy with this woman to understand why she hoards, and to have some understanding about how to help with ways to stop that. She's not going to. So we engage other resources to help manage that hoarding. So when we're looking at dementia and hoarding, and we're looking at more and more cases of it, we've got to get creative and figure out how we can get other resources in to help. We've talked about hoarding as a coping mechanism already, so let's move on to talking about therapy and how we do this. As you can imagine, most of the time when we find out about a hoarding situation, it's in crisis. And the idea of having long-term mental health work before attending to the crisis just isn't going to happen. In an ideal world, we would be able to engage with the person who hoards years before the hoarding becomes unsafe and becomes a real problem, years before the city gets involved. But we most often don't get our perfect world. So we have to sort of flip the script. And where we might like to start with long-term mental health, we have to instead change that and attend to safety first. Attend to crisis intervention first. So we start out with what has to happen. In some cases, the city has condemned the home, so the person needs to find another place to live while the house gets cleaned out and brought to safety so that they can move back in. Or other arrangements need to be made depending on what the particular situation is. So what we do then is engage in crisis work. Work on the stress management, work on mindfulness, work on helping the person to regulate their emotions so that this process of cleanout will be the least damaging to that person. Then once the person is safe, once the home has been cleaned out or other arrangements have been made, then we engage in the long-term mental health. And that's where we do the grief and loss work. That's where we do the hoarding behaviors work. That has to come afterwards. So we are addressing the public safety concerns right off the bat, but we're also making sure that mental health is involved so that this doesn't just become a clean out and then the person is left sort of with nothing trying to figure out what they do. This graph shows you why simply cleaning out a home, which is called a forced clean out, when the person who hoards does not want this to happen, it shows why this is so problematic. If you look at the chart, you see where it takes 10 years to get a house to a certain level of hoard. And then you see the clean out. What we have found is that in cases in which mental health is not engaged, within 3 to 6 months, the home will be re-hoarded worse than it was. So again, it takes 10 years to get to a certain level. Forced clean out, and within 3 to 6 months, the home is re-hoarded worse than it was. That is a trauma response. And let's talk about that for a minute. the things, the hoard, often become this place of safety for a person. Now, as we look at it, it's not safe, and physically it's not safe, and emotionally and mentally it's not safe. But as they see it, this is where their safety is. They're surrounded by their things. It's almost as though they are protected. They have a sort of barrier around them. When we come in and we do a forced clean out, or when families come in, we've had families say that they waited until their loved one went on vacation, then they went into the house until we cleaned it out. I guarantee you that's not a good way to go about it, and that's a sure way to ruin family relationships. The families had a good intentions of wanting their loved one to be safe, but they completely did not understand that they had just removed all of the safety for that person. So the stuff that is collected, the stuff that is hoarded, gives some measure of safety and security to the person who hoards. And when we take that away, what we have done is take away their sense of safety and security. We have taken what protects them. We've taken the coping mechanism away. And so what they have to do, if there is no mental health engagement involved, is they have to replenish the stuff so that they become safe again. The real sadness for me in this graph is that in order to get a home re-hoarded worse than it was in 6 months, that person must be working almost 24 hours a day to bring stuff back in. It must be a frantic sense of terror almost, this lack of safety. So again, when we can understand that, when we can help the families understand that, they are not then continuing to suggest a clean out while the loved one's on vacation. They develop a better understanding for what's really going on here. The quote here that talks about these instances of a clean out was a particular article that was written on some research with 3 case studies. And in all 3 situations, the homeowners were seniors, and their homes were forced cleaned out without the mental health work engaged. And all 3 passed away within a very short period of time, moving back into their cleaned out home. Again, trauma response, and for these elderly folks, they just didn't have, it was too much. It was too much. So I do not at all intend to say that everyone who gets a forced clean out will pass away, but to show that it has happened, but certainly that this is a potentially traumatizing event, and we've got to be really careful, because we still do have to clean out homes. We have to have a commitment to the safety of the individual, to the safety of people coming to the home, to the safety of a firefighter responding to a fire call. It takes seconds, just seconds, for a firefighter in a hoarded home to get so confused and disoriented about where they are that they can't find their way out. This is a public safety issue, and we must make sure that neighbors are safe, communities are safe. And so sometimes we are going to have a response of forced cleanout. But as I have been saying, and I'm sure you've picked it up by now, we involve mental health, we're going to have a much better response than just simply the clean out and then sort of leaving the person to try and figure out what to do from here. At what point is hoarding reportable to the authorities? If you are a mandated reporter, then hoarding falls under this mandated reporting structure. So it's the same as any other situation in which you would find yourself. If there's threat of endangerment to the health and safety of a child, of an older adult, of a person with a disability, or an animal, you must report. Right now, the language in the mandate for adult protective services and child protective services doesn't have good language that fits with hoarding. So unfortunately, there have been professionals who have gone to APS and asked them to visit a home, to open a file, And based on what their mandate is, they haven't been able to do that. I'm hoping that one of the things that we can do in the coming months and years is to change our legislation, is to change our language, and to enable adult protective services and child protective services to have better language so that they can open files, so that there can be a better response. Because a person living in a hoarded home is not safe, and they cannot continue to be living in such a home. The bottom line is animal control does have, yes?
I'm sorry that I interrupted you. I thought I was speaking in a pause. We've got a couple questions out here of how do you motivate someone with hoarding behavior to agree to counseling when they refuse it? Another question, do people who hoard ask for help or seek help, or are they most often forced, is it forced on them? And a final question, they kind of fit together, is how much impact has the Great Depression affected this generation and their hoarding?
Okay, all good questions. So I'll answer, and if I don't answer one of those, please interrupt me again and give them to me. We do see an impact of the Depression on this generation. The thing is, in very specific terms, in terms of research, people who survived the Depression are not considered to be people who hoard. However, the result of their behaviors is the same. So it's sort of a splitting hairs kind of thing. And certainly the Depression fits unresolved trauma and loss for some people. But the bottom line is, in terms of our treatment, people who survive the Depression and have kept too many things and are living in a hoarded home are living in unsafe homes. And so we have to address those similar to the way that we address people who hoard. Most often, the person who hoards does not reach out for help, either because they do not believe that there's a problem or because they are afraid. And the idea of losing all of these things is too overwhelming. So often our referrals come from family members and other professionals. Someone from Meals on Wheels makes a report, that they can't get into the home, that kind of thing. But I do want to say that we have seen in the last, I would say, 2 months, a rise in our phone calls at the Hoarding Project from people who hoard, who are reaching out. So it would appear to me that some of the education and awareness raising is beginning to have a positive effect, that people who hoard are recognizing that there are people out there who are not going to judge them negatively for their behaviors, but that could offer them help. So it is possible to have someone who hoards reach out for some help. Pat, what was the first question that you read?
The first question is, how do you motivate someone with hoarding behavior to agree to counseling?
So we'll see in a couple of screens that one of the things that we use is motivational interviewing. That we talk to a person who hoards about what it is that they want for their lives. I had a client who came to me and said, she was someone in her 50s, and she said, growing up in our family, we always had people over for dinner, and I loved having people for dinner. I haven't had anyone in my home for over a decade because of my hoarding. And that was she had high motivation around that, and so we used that as the motivation to help her clean out her home and to have it stay cleaned out. It's much better to take the client's motivation rather than something that we put on them, and to help them to continue to do their work in order to get them to where they want to be. Of course, if someone does not want to get counseling, if someone does not want help, then we can't force them. The only thing that we can force is we can enforce a code, safety code, and the city code for housing. But we can't force someone to come and get therapy. All we can do is tell them that it will help, that we think that it will be more effective for them and make the process easier. But of course, we can't force anyone to therapy. Animal hoarding is similar and different to object hoarding. When we have issues of animal hoarding, almost always we are dealing with squalor, and almost always we are dealing with mental illness versus a mental health issue. And so we have to, again, take a different approach. This doesn't mean that we wouldn't engage in mental health treatment with a person, but it may look different. Animal control has better language and can get involved sooner in a situation, and they will work with a client, perhaps just providing a safe place for their animals for a time, as well as getting them the nourishment that they need, that kind of thing. The thing to remember when we're talking about animal hoarding is that the person who hoards animals started with the best intentions. They love animals. But something happened, and likely this is where their mental illness comes in, and they no longer can keep the animals or themselves safe. So that's something to keep in mind around animal hoarding. The resources that are available, of course, we have the Hoarding Project, the International OCD Foundation. If your client does have obsessive-compulsive symptoms and has hoarding, the OCD Foundation can be extremely helpful. They've got great information on their website about addressing both. The Institute of Challenging Disorganization is an organization of professional organizers who are specializing in hoarding behaviors, and excellent information from them. Children of Hoarders is an online support group, and this can be something that can be helpful as a first step because, of course, people are anonymous. As I said before, the Hoarding Project has support groups, as does Children of Hoarders and Clutterers Anonymous. You can get a hold of us.
Oh, I'm sorry, Janet. There are two chat boxes going here at the same time. I see your slide on how to get a hold of you, but we've got a few minutes left and there's a couple more questions for you. One person asks, how much stuff is considered hoarding? If the kitchen and living room areas of the home are clean and open, but the bedrooms and other rooms are stuffed, is that considered hoarding?
Yes, it is. Again, go back to the definition, and if rooms can't be used for their intended purpose, then you've got a hoarding situation. Now, if you've got a home that has only a couple of rooms that are hoarded, then you've got a situation in which you're likely to be able to have more successful work sooner in helping that person, get that part of the house into safety. But they obviously have other areas of the home that are safe. But you can't just say, well, it's only a few rooms, so it's not a problem. It still can be a problem structurally, depending on what is being hoarded. It can be a problem with mold, with that kind of thing. So it's still hoarding, and it still needs to be addressed.
Okay, we've got one last question here. How do we teach better interpersonal skills so there is less emotional abandonment that can last for decades? And talking about ambiguous loss, which can easily lead to hoarding.
Yeah, that's a question that we could spend a whole day on, isn't it? I think what I would say in this very short time is to approach, in terms of the interpersonal skills, to approach this situation with compassion and with the attempt to communicate both compassion and to help others to develop compassion around the situation so that they change the perspective that they have. And you're right, ambiguous losses very often are seen hand in hand with hoarding. Oftentimes ambiguous loss is not recognized by people. you know, if a person is in process, well, they haven't lost anything. Well, they have. But oftentimes it's not recognized as it is with a loss, say, that has more definition, like a death or something like that. So it really, I think the first thing that I would say is to work on that developing understanding and compassion. And my experience has been that the more we educate, the more people are able to develop that kind of compassion. There is
okay, if you want to finish up, Janet, I can see that there is so much interest and so many topics we have touched on that I think that we'll try to get another webinar together if you're willing to answer even more of these questions.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And I do just want to say one more thing, and that is that the Hoarding Task Force is at the State Fair this year. If you're coming to the State Fair, please go to the Education Building and see our booth there. You can talk to more folks about hoarding and how we address it. And also, Governor Dayton has proclaimed September as Hoarding Awareness Month in Minnesota. And the task force and the Hoarding Project will have events throughout the month about hoarding and how to help people. So please check our website and come to the State Fair and get more information and more sort of awareness raising for yourselves.
Good. This has been an absolutely wonderful webinar, Janet. It's just sparked so many questions and so much interest.
Great.
People are also saying they are looking for options outside of the metro area for hoarding, but I'm afraid very shortly the system is going to cut us off and most people have to go back to work.
We are working outstate. We are developing collaborations with folks outstate. So the more that we get people who are out of the 7-county metro area involved, the more we'll be able to help with resources there.
Great. Just before we lose anybody, I want to tell you that continuing education certificates are available today from the Boards of Social Work and Nursing. They're free of charge if you're a member of MGS. They are $25 if you're a non-member. To obtain this benefit, please consider joining MGS. The application is available at mngero.org. An annual membership is very inexpensive, just a very tiny bit more than the cost of 2 webinars. And we host 10 to 12 webinars each year, so you'd have free CEUs for each of them. We'd love to have your involvement, so watch for your evaluation survey. Also, we've got a number of people that were unable to either get on the line or see the PowerPoint slides, and they'll be posted to our MGS website after the webinar later today.